Good morning. We're going to talk about chapter 4 today. It looks like a lot of reading for this week. So let me just explain it to you. Chapter 4 is connected to chapters 10, 11, and 12. And so chapter 4 gives like the intro and the basics. Chapters 10, 11, and 12 expand a little bit. But if you take it in the order of the book, then what feels like is happening is you're doing chapter 4, then you're doing a lot of statistics stuff. Then all of a sudden, here you are looking at these other chapters that are back with chapter 4. So I think it makes more sense to connect them right now. It's just kind of like looking at different designs and then going a little bit more depth into those. We kind of do it anyway. That way it won't feel like we're doing it twice. I hope that makes sense. Don't stress so much about the reading. Do it as much as you can. You do need to read all of the things that are written for you in the modules. You'll probably be okay if you catch up on the weekend or something. This week is probably the worst week for reading. Other weeks aren't so bad. And I'm going to try and do a little bit shorter lecture to give you a little bit more time. The primary assignment for this week, in addition to the labs, is this beginning draft of your introduction. So you're going to take a stab at writing an intro. It'll be a draft. Just do your best. And what I'm going to do is comment on them. I'm giving you a format to follow on Tuesday, and then you'll have the opportunity to try it out. I'll make comments on your drafts, so you can use those comments to improve your draft and then turn it in again later. So it doesn't have to be perfect today or tomorrow. Just do your best, take a stab at using the format we talk about, and then use my comments as you construct your final introduction for your research proposal. Speaking of which, I'm hoping that you have made a final decision on what you're going to do the research proposal on, because you will need to start working from that last week and this week, right? Okay, so here we go with chapter 4. A little bit of history first. Chapter 4 is about using the scientific method. This is what makes psychology a science, as opposed to just sitting around and chatting with somebody or watching people and sort of making observations without any systematic method. Lots of people have used observations forever to look at things and kind of make up, come to conclusions, etc. And so kind of the story is that people just ran around willy-nilly doing, biased observations until magically in the age of the Enlightenment, the scientific method was revealed and came down from the sky. And okay, you know what I'm saying. It's not that simple. That's not how things happened. What we have done in our histories, we have really emphasized recent events and kind of ignored events that were longer ago, obviously for obvious reasons, because we didn't live back then. We don't have as much material. We don't have as much understanding. And so instead of saying, well, it could be various things happen then that we don't know, what we tend to do is say, well, we know more than they did, because anyone who lived before us was not as advanced, obviously, right? Because we're more advanced and smarter. Anyway, so we should be a little more humble about our kind of black and white ideas about when the scientific method started. So it's generally thought to be, we didn't have the scientific method until mid-1600s, when the Enlightenment or the rational age started, that sort of thing. It was really about philosophy through time. A lot of philosophy dealt with scientific methodology. How do you know truth? Which is really what we're doing when we're looking at science. How can I find out something that's true? And so the study of epistemology, or ways to know truth, has been the purview of philosophers forever. And a lot of what they talked about had to do with science, the scientific method. They didn't call it that, but that's what it was. How to make observations, how to find out what is true. Lots of ancient I can say that word really. Lots of ancient civilizations used parts of the scientific method. Of course, we have this handy dandy little list right now that we go through, and this is exactly the way we do it. But it's not as if nobody's ever done science before. Certainly lots of people have done things that are similar to the scientific method, or in some ways very useful. Certainly the science of observation, the science of empiricism, which is using observations to identify truth. In other words, how do I know something's true? Well, it's because I saw it. That's empiricism. How do I know something is true? Well, because it works. That's pragmatism, for example. How do I know something is true? Well, God told me. So that's revelation. So what we're talking about here is empiricism, the way of knowing something's true by observing it. I saw it with my own eyes. I observe it. I measured it. I weighed it, etc. So ancient China, they used observations. They used measurements. They made hypotheses, gathering evidence, testing their evidence. Many of their concepts in ancient China don't map onto our scientific concepts. We don't have the same kind of historical understanding of the world, the worldview that they do. And so because our worldviews differ, what happened was that people with a lot of pride or hubris or whatever would say, well, our worldviews differ, and since we know we're right, obviously they're wrong. Or we are cultured and civilized and we don't understand them, therefore they're not. And so you can see the kind of Western centrism here that ends up creating the way we think about the rest of the world and the way we think of science as only existing here in the West, in Western civilization per se. So I think we got to be careful of that. Just because we don't understand the worldview or the concepts used in another culture doesn't mean that they're primitive. It doesn't mean that they're not using science. If you look at ancient understanding of astronomy or how the world worked, there are some astonishing things that people understood that could be only obtained through the use of what we call the scientific method. So it didn't just bloom into being suddenly out of nothing in the age of the Enlightenment. It had been discussed, talked about, refined, for 1,000 years. It wasn't the same thing that people came up with the Enlightenment that had been talked about for thousands of years. There's a little bit of a different modification, a different list of how you do it, but it's not to say that there was no science. All right. So the scientific method that we have in our culture is this. We use systematic observation. Lots of cultures have used some forms of systematic observation. To be systematic, you can make an observation. I can watch all the things my son eats when he comes down from his bedroom and walks into the kitchen, and I can observe what he eats. But is that systematic? It might be that I'm only observing when I'm around, or it might be that I'm only paying attention when I hear the refrigerator open. Maybe he comes down other times when I'm not around or doesn't open the fridge and I don't notice, right? So if I just kind of willy-nilly observe him in the kitchen, that's not systematic. A systematic observation would have rules, selection criteria. What is it that gets measured? How can I make sure that I'm not missing out on something? How can I eliminate things that aren't relevant, extraneous variables? And so if I think, okay, every time it's noon, that's when my son will definitely come into the kitchen and eat something. So if I'm going to eliminate an extraneous variable, let's say that he works, which he does. Let's say he's working and then he has a break from work that happens to be at noon. And it's the break that makes him eat and not the fact that it's noon, right? So I'd have to eliminate that as an extraneous variable and look at what happens on the days he doesn't work. Does he still eat at noon, or does he eat at a different time? Does that make sense? So systematic observation, carefully defining rules, defining selection criteria. In other words, how and what are we measuring? Measurement in itself is part of the scientific method. In order to make an observation that's systematic, that you can connect to something else, you have to somehow measure. Even if it's a crude measurement, the measurement has to be reliable and valid. So the measurement will tell you the same thing each time, like a ruler should, and it has to actually tell you the truth. So for example, if you have a ruler and you measure the same thing and it comes out with different numbers every time you measure it, that's not a reliable measurement. It's not a reliable ruler. You would throw that out. You would say this ruler is magically wrong, something. Okay, you experiment. So you try something and see if it makes a difference. Then you formulate, you test hypotheses, and then you take your results and you modify the future hypotheses. So it works best for things, phenomena that are always the same. In other words, if I give you some ginger when you're car sick and it always helps you, then you can say something about, well, ginger seems to help when I'm car sick. But let's say you're sick, but not because of motion sickness. Let's say you're sick because you ate some horrible seafood soup or something that went bad. And I give you ginger. Well, actually, ginger would probably still help you. Bad example. So let's say I give you something else, Dramamine. Let's say I give you Dramamine. Well, Dramamine is really good for motion sickness, but it may not do anything for if you're sick to your stomach because of, food poisoning. So what you want to do is make sure the phenomena, the motion sickness is the same thing. Then when you're applying the scientific method, that will work. So when we talk about the scientific method, we're talking about something that has internal validity and external validity. Internal validity and external validity are critical to using science. So internal validity basically says you have to have enough control over what you're looking at so that you know the only thing that differs between the groups you're looking at is that manipulated variable. And so I'll explain more about what this means. Let's say you're observing plants. You want to grow plants. You're wondering if the music that you're listening to makes a difference in terms of growing plants. And so you have to have enough control over that experience, that experiment, so that the only thing that changes is music. Everything else has to be the same. We call that controlled. If it's all the same, it's the same thing as being controlled. So you're controlling for, that means you're making it the same in both groups. So the only thing that varies is that independent variable, the variable that you are deciding to change. It's independent of anything except for your decision. And so if there's a change, you can say it's as a result of your independent variable, the variable that you as the experimenter changed. So that independent variable would be what music was being played. You're growing the plants, you have the same plants, the same soil, the same planting methods, the same fertilizer, sunlight, water, all of the things are the same. Every single thing is the same. The only thing that differs is what music is played, and that's it. And so since that's the only thing that differs, you can then attribute any change or any difference between the group to that one variable, because everything else was the same. That essentially is the scientific method. And so the game is, how can I make everything the same? And in order to make everything the same, you have to know a lot. So how do I find out enough about things to know that I have everything as the same? To know that I have everything controlled and to know that I'm manipulating something that can make a difference. So that the attribution I make is correct, that it was the independent variable that made the difference, that made that change. The variable that I manipulated as the researcher was the reason why I had a difference between those two groups. That is the whole game of internal validity and science. That's the fun in it. It's like, okay, how can I logically construct this so that I know the independent variable was what made the difference? External validity is about application. So I got these results. Let's say you get results in a lab. This happens a lot. Results from a lab may not apply to results with real people. And so you test a drug in a lab, and it's great, and everything looks wonderful. And then you start testing it on actual real people in a clinical situation, and suddenly it doesn't perform the same that it performed in the lab. And so there's trouble with external validity. In other words, trouble applying the results from the lab to results in real life. So external validity is about, do your observations apply to the actual real world, or do they only apply to the people who were actually in your experiment? So you have to balance your external validity needs with internal validity needs. And a lot of times something with really high internal validity has less external validity, and vice versa. Because with the amount of control that you want to have excellent internal validity, what you're losing is real world application. Because in the real world, you don't have control. Lots of other variables play into it. You can't control those things. And so it's possible that the thing that worked beautifully in your lab won't work beautifully outside the lab. So external validity is another piece of a good experiment. How externally valid are your findings? You want to balance those needs. So the example here is, let's say a lab grew beans to Mozart. So they're playing Mozart while they're growing beans. And you think, okay, that's great. It's classical music, right? And I want to grow a plant to classical music. And so in your mind, you're applying beans and Mozart, you're interpreting it as plants and classical music. Well, what if it's not all classical music? What if it's just Mozart? You know, maybe Mozart has a clarity that is not found in other types of music. Maybe there's something going on with Mozart that makes a difference. Maybe it's beans. Maybe beans are more sensitive to music than African violets. You're not sure. And so the question is, how well do these lab results apply to what you want to do? That's the external validity question. So you've got internal validity of an experiment, external validity of the experiment. And then when you're looking at measures, you also have to look at validity and reliability for those. And so to clarify, this can sometimes be a little bit confusing. We use the word validity to apply to how we measure things, but we also use the word validity to apply to internal and external, the actual experiment. So validity means truth. Is the experiment true in terms of the inner logic? Is the experiment true as it applies to the world? Those are two ways we're using that validity term. Then we're going to go in farther to examine just the measurement. And we're also using those words. Is the measurement true? So as part of the truth of the internal experiment, the internal validity, part of that is the measurement validity. And so we talk about reliability and validity of measures, but that's part of the larger picture of internal validity for the experiment. And of course, if the internal validity is poor, or if the measurement validity is poor, then the external validity will also be poor. Right, so your measures have to be like a ruler in the sense that they're always giving the same result for the same length. You want your measures to be valid and reliable. So if your measure conforms to the standard, like for example, let's say you have an inch or a ruler, and on your ruler, the inch really corresponds to an actual inch. Now let's say you run across, here's the gold standard of an inch, you know, and they keep it in the museum, and you go in and you kind of look at your ruler and you see, does my ruler match the gold standard? Okay, so then if it does, you know that your ruler is an inch, your inch is actually an inch, that is valid. The validity is that your inch matches the gold standard. And if your inch doesn't change, let's say you don't have any magic markings on your rulers that go back and forth, but they actually stay where they're put, then that's a reliable measure. So then your inch, your ruler inch would be reliable and valid. So your measures have to be reliable and valid. When you observe things, the observations also have to be reliable and valid. You have to know that what you're observing is interpreted in the way that you're interpreting it. So let's say you're observing somebody being angry. Well, you're interpreting their anger. What your observation would be, this person knocked over a table. And so you're saying, well, they're angry, but the actual observation would be they knocked over a table. You're interpreting it as them being angry. So you have to be careful when you do observing that your observations correspond to something that doesn't involve interpretation, because interpretation then introduces error, because not everyone will interpret that the same way. So next, we're going to look at what is it that you're observing or measuring. This is the idea of a construct. So a construct is not just a scientific term, it's like a philosophical term as well. The construct is the idea. It's the something that you've constructed in your mind. We call it a construct. So a construct might be the same thing as a concept or an idea. Okay, so we're just going to use the word construct. Plant growth is an example of a construct. You have some ideas about what is a plant growth about. And so what you have to do is put your ideas down in a systematic way so that they are the same. And so if I'm saying plant growth and my next door neighbor says plant growth, you want both of us to have the same idea about how plant growth is measured, or in other words, how to operationalize plant growth. So this is the concept of operationalizing. You have to be able to have the same idea of what it is you're measuring. And so you have this construct, let's call it plant growth. Maybe for me, plant growth means width, and for my neighbor, it means length. Maybe for me, plant growth means color of the leaves and how fruitful the plant is. How many tomatoes did it bear? And for my neighbor, plant growth is how long are my tomato leaves, something like that. In that case, we have differing ideas of what that underlying construct is. And so we're going to operationalize that construct differently. I'm operationalizing it by measuring color and fruit. My neighbor's operationalizing it by looking at length. Make sense? So we have to make sure that we are really clear about how we define our construct. Defining the construct is part of being scientific, being very clear, very precise. So clarity and precision are scientific concepts, and we apply them across the board because what we're looking for is being as precise as possible in our measurements so that the next person knows exactly what we're talking about. So our experiments can be replicated. So how you measure a thing is what we call operationalizing. You operationalize something by deciding how you're going to define it, how you're going to measure it. That's how you operationalize something. And so if I say you want to measure plant growth, what is your operational definition of plant growth? What you're going to tell me is how am I going to measure it? So this is a really important concept to get. If I want to know how you operationalize a variable, what you're going to tell me is how you measured that variable. That's your operational definition. The measurement is the operational definition. And so if you're measuring the plant and you're saying growth equals size, size isn't good enough. What I need is a measurement. So you could say, I've got this plant measurement. It's called plant growth, and it measures 6 different aspects of plant growth. And then you add them all up, and that's your measurement called plant growth. And that's how I'm going to operationalize plant growth for my study. Well, then that would be a pretty decent way of operationalizing this, much better than just saying how big it gets. right? So you want some precise and clear measurements that help you operationalize your construct. Okay, I hope that makes sense. You're operationalizing your construct, you're taking your idea and you're applying a precise measurement of your idea. And you're saying the measurement of your idea, of your construct, that is how you're operationalizing it. Okay, next thing to talk about is independent and dependent variables. So some of you have been working on this since 4th grade. For some of you, this is new territory. It's not hard. And I'm hoping that I've been kind of setting you up to understand this up to this point. The independent variable, that's the variable that we talk about the researchers changing or manipulating. And so if you're saying, here's a variable that I want to change, for example, type of music for plants, that's the independent variable. It's independent because it doesn't depend on other variables in the study. So it's not like if the amount of sunlight will change the type of music that is in the room. Or it's not like the amount of fertilizer or water you use will change the type of music. You're the one who changes the music. So in the plant example, type of music is the independent variable. It's the one variable that the experimenter manipulates or changes. And so the manipulated variable is another term for independent variable. They mean the same thing. The controlled variables, those are all the ones you hold constant. So we call that controlled. Amount of sun is a controlled variable, but type of music is an independent variable. It's the variable the researcher changes. What you're measuring, and so if you're going to use that plant measure, plant growth or how big the plant gets, whatever it is, that's your outcome variable. That's what you're measuring at the end to see if there was a difference that was made by the independent variable. So if you're going to change the independent variable like music, then you want to measure whether that had an effect on plant growth. So you measure plant growth. Plant growth is your outcome variable or your dependent variable. Same thing. The outcome variable is the same thing as the dependent variable. The independent variable is the same thing as the manipulated variable. So those terms are all used interchangeably. So if I manipulate an independent variable, then I measure the dependent variable to see what difference it made. So let's review some examples for independent and dependent variable just to help you with them. If you've got this down, great. If not, hopefully these examples will help you. So here's an example. Matthias wants to know if he gets more studying done in the library or in his dorm. So he does everything the same. So he's doing a lot of control of variables. For example, he will study the same subjects in the same order with the same snacks before and after, with the same music in his headphones, or with the same time of day, or with the same nap before, whatever it is. He does everything the same, except he changes where he studies. That's the only variable that differs. And so the independent variable is the one that he changes. In other words, where he studies. That's the one thing that he can manipulate. The dependent variable is what his outcome is. And so he has to operationalize the construct of how much studying I get done. And that operational definition of how much studying I get done, that is the outcome. That is the dependent variable. And so if he operationalizes the dependent variable to equal number of pages that I read, or to equal number of hours I could last, or however he decides to operationalize it, that's his operational definition. And then he's going to measure that as the dependent variable. Here's another example. Emily wonders if her cat eats more quickly from a cookie tray or from a bowl. So Emily feeds the cat at the same time daily. Same food, same place, same everything. Those are the controlled variables. So since the only thing that differs between those two situations is whether or not she's using a tray or a bowl, then that tray versus bowl, that is the independent variable. That's the thing that the experimenter is changing. Then she says, okay, I want to know if the cat eats more quickly. Well, what does that mean, to eat more quickly? Her construct is, I eat more quickly. How she operationalizes that construct is by measuring the number of minutes the cat spends eating and by measuring how much food is eaten. Both of those things together are in her measurement of quick eating. Okay, so the independent variable is the one she changes, the tray versus the bowl. The dependent variable is how quickly the cat eats, or operationalized as number of minutes and amount eaten. Okay, I'll say it one more time just to be more clear. You operationalize your construct so that you know what you're measuring. So the operational definition of eats more quickly equals minutes eaten and amount eaten. That's the operational definition of quick eating. The independent variable is the variable Emily changes, which is it a tray or is it a bowl? The dependent variable is how quickly did the cat eat, as operationalized by number of minutes and amount eaten. All right, next example, final example. Tess wants to know, is a window bird feeder going to attract more cardinals, or would a tree hanging feeder? You know those window bird feeders that you like stick up right against the window? You kind of attach them to the window with those plastic kind of things that they like stick to the window. And then the birds can just come hang out on the feeder. It's a glass feeder or a plastic feeder. And you can just look at it through the window. It's pretty cool. Or you can hang a bird feeder from a tree. So Tess wants to know, which bird feeder attracts more cardinals? So in this case, what is the independent variable? What is the dependent variable? How might Tess operationalize the dependent variable? So these are the questions to answer in order to make this a scientific experiment, to use the scientific method, instead of just, at breakfast, what do you notice, right? So that's not very scientific, because you're not having systematic observations. That's what makes it not scientific. If you have systematic observations, then it's a scientific experiment. So let's say you had everything is the same, the type of food, the amount of food, when you stock the feeder is the same, the amount of rain that falls on the feeder under the tree versus under the window, that's the same. The geographical area, same. All of those things are the variables that you're controlling. Everything you're holding constant, everything that you're keeping the same, those are controlled variables. So you're controlling those things. The only thing that you're changing is the type of feeder. Is it a window bird feeder or a tree hanging feeder? So the independent variable is the thing you change. Window feeder versus tree hanging feeder. The dependent variable is what you're measuring to see the outcome. And so if you operationalize number of cardinals as just a straight up count, how many cardinals landed on this feeder, then that would be a way of operationalizing that dependent variable. You could count how many times a cardinal landed on the feeder. Well, one of the things you might think about is, well, what if it's like the same cardinal and one of them is really attached to the geographical area right by the tree, and then there are other cardinals that really like that area by the house. So you can see that that might affect the internal validity of your experiment, because now it's not about the feeder, it's about geographical location. It's about your territory. So you may have cardinals that have territory that differs, and that's why they're feeding at those feeders, not because of the type of feeder. So that would be a threat to internal validity. Hopefully that makes sense. A threat to internal validity. But here, the example, just in terms of independent and dependent variables, which feeder is the independent variable? The dependent variable is how many cardinals. and how it depends on how test operationalizes the dependent variable. You would, of course, need to know enough to know that maybe cardinals are territorial. How territorial are cardinals? You would have to know that in order to do a really good job of creating a study. So that's an example of why you have to learn things about the thing you're studying, why you have to do past research, why you have to look at what else has been studied so that you can be knowledgeable enough to create a good, solid, internally valid experiment. Okay, when you're operationalizing, so what we've done is we've looked at independent variable and dependent variable. We've looked at internal validity and external validity. And so right now we're going to talk about what does it mean to operationalize. So when you operationalize something, basically what you're saying is, here's this construct, here's how I'm going to measure it. So the construct is not the operationalization. The how I'm going to measure it is how you operationalize. When you operationalize a construct, when you decide this is how I'm going to measure it, your measurement has to have reliability and validity. So we talked about this a little bit last week when we talked about choosing measures with reliable, valid data that are attached to them. And so this is just a quick review. Reliability means it measures the same thing every time. So for example, a person's scores on some sort of a test should not vary unless something happens. An IQ test, if you take an IQ test on Monday and then you take another IQ test 6 months later on a Monday, your scores should be pretty much the same. If your scores differ, then that means that IQ test is not reliable, because we know IQ doesn't really change very much throughout life. Mood, your mood might be different. And so what you want to make sure is that what it's measuring is actually your mood and not like your mood ring or the effect of the color of shirt you're wearing on the person who's giving you the test. You want to make sure that these things that are measured are the same thing. Sometimes you can measure something that is supposed to be subject to change. And in that case, you want your measurement to be sensitive enough to change, to pick up change. So therapy outcome is an example. You don't want your measurement to always be the same, because then it doesn't reflect anything that's valid about changes that occur. Let's say you're giving a person a measure of therapy outcome, or you could say it's of anxiety, anxiety in the moment. It doesn't make sense that your measurement should be the same every single Monday, because anxiety changes from moment to moment. It doesn't make sense that your therapy outcome measure would be the same every single week. You want your therapy outcome measure to reflect actual changes in therapy that happened. So there are 4 ways in which you can make sure that your measurement is valid. So we talked about reliability. It should measure the same thing each time. But we also want to talk about validity. It should measure the truth. And there are 4 ways to look at test validity: construct validity, content validity, face validity, and criterion validity. When you take quizzes, you can use your notes. Okay, so don't stress about having to memorize these things. You can always look them up. I want you to understand them. And so understanding these 4 types of validity, it's not hard, especially if you decide you're not going to stress about memorizing them. So construct validity, now that you really are familiar with the word construct means, it's a little simpler to understand what that means. Construct validity means, does the test actually measure the idea or the concept or the construct that it says it measures? Let's say your test measures anxiety. Well, is it actually measuring anxiety, or is it measuring love of spinach? You have to pick. You have to decide that love of spinach is not part of your construct, and then create a measure that doesn't include love of spinach, that only includes anxiety. Content validity is a way of looking at what does it include. Do the questions on your test, on your questionnaire, on your measure, do those questions represent the extent of the construct it says it's measuring. And so anxiety, if you say, does your stomach feel tense or nauseous? And that's the only question you have about anxiety. This may not measure anxiety very well. It might just measure the state of your stomach. But anxiety is more than just the state of your stomach. And anxiety for some people might not be about their stomach. Not very many. Most people have some sort of stomach involvement. But you have to make sure that you're asking a wide enough range of questions to capture the entire construct. You want to make sure you get the whole thing in your screen when you take that picture, not just part of it. Right? So if you took a picture of your roommate and you only took a picture of her ear, and you said, well, this represents my roommate, your roommate might say, you know, there's a little more to me than my ear. So it's not content valid. You want to explore and include all of the content, not just a slice. Face validity means that those questions actually look like they do measure the construct. So if I give you a test and I say this test is about anxiety, and the first question is, do you like spinach? You might think, this test is not about anxiety. This test is about spinach, right? So the question, do you like spinach, has no face validity. It doesn't look like it measures the construct. And so while face validity is not good for the only measurement of validity, you can't say, well, it's face valid, therefore it is valid. Face valid is a part of validity. It has to look like it measures the same thing. And then criteria validity. Criterion validity means the test results are going to correlate with or match other measures of the same thing. So let's say I give you a test on anxiety and I ask you questions about how tense, how upset is your stomach, how much are you worried, how much are you having anxiety-provoking thoughts, do you think you're anxious, etc., all those things. And then I give you another test called like the state trait anxiety inventory, which we talked about. And your results from my test and the results from the STAI correlate. You know, the STAI says you have high anxiety. My test says you have high anxiety. That is criterion related validity. So my test correlates with another gold standard, something that we know measures the thing we're talking about. That's criterion validity. Here's an example of both criterion validity and something we're going to call inter-rater reliability. This is mentioned a little later in your chapter on surveys. And so this is the Yale Preoperative Anxiety Scale, the MYPAS. The M is because it was modified after it was constructed. So they call it the MYPAS. When I was working at Yale in research, we did a lot of studies that used this measure. This measure was a way of operationalizing preoperative anxiety. So you have a kid who is about to go into surgery, they're anxious, or how anxious are they? And so we wanted a measure of how anxious they were. So the construct was preoperative anxiety. We operationalized that as their score on the modified YPAS. So here is what the YPAS measured. This was, of course, not a questionnaire you give the kid, because some of these kids are like 4 years old, or even if they're 9 or 10, they're not great responders to a question about how anxious they are before surgery. You know, when they're 9 or 10, they're more interested in being anxious or doing something else. And then a lot of times you have parents who may have biases about how anxious their kid is. And so it may be that the parents are not a great way to measure the actual kid's anxiety. So what they decided to do was operationalize preoperative anxiety as something that could be observed by a trained observer. And so when I say a trained observer, if I say to you, go look in that room, see how anxious Johnny is, and you go look and you're like, well, I would say on a scale of 0 to 10, Johnny's anxiety is like a 6. You know, and then I ask some other people, yeah, his anxiety was a 6 before. Would you go in and just kind of eyeball him and tell me on a scale? Well, who knows what scale you're using versus the other people? that have also looked at Johnny. We don't know that what you're measuring is the same thing. And so when we operationalize preoperative anxiety in an observer measure, we have to be really precise as we define what we're looking at. And so that YPAS does this. It looks at a number of different domains, and it's very precise in its definitions. So any sort of observer, once they receive training in this, can make the same observations. In other words, their observations should match another observer's observations. And so when we use the YPAS, we would train people to do it so that they matched like the criterion, the gold standard. We would have actually training videos. What they had to do was look at the video and use the YPAS and make their observations, and their numbers had to match pretty close to the gold standard for us to say that they were reliable enough to use the YPAS, so that they learned it well enough. So when they said that kids' anxiety is a 6, anyone else who used the YPAS would go in and would agree, yes, based on the precise criteria of the YPAS, that needs to be scored as a 6. And so here are the scoring rules. Thought this might be interesting for you to just get a sense of, so that you could see how a real life measure is constructed and how that construct of preoperative anxiety is operationalized in the YPAS. So the first thing you look at is the kid's activity. What is the child doing? Are they curious? Are they just playing around with toys? You know, they're going around with their parent, they're moving around to get toys. That would be a 1, the lowest level of anxiety. If they're running, pushing, unfocused, clinging, trying to get away, you know, that sort of an activity, then that's a 4. That indicates more anxiety. Vocalizations is another domain that you look at on the YPAS. What is the kid saying? What are their vocalizations sound like? Are they laughing? Are they confidently answering questions, etc.? Or are they crying, screaming no, saying no through the mask, etc.? Emotional expressivity is another domain. What do their emotions look like? And here are the specific ways to measure what their emotions look like. Happy, neutral, worried, distressed. You get enough experience looking at a kid so that your answer will match other people's answers. Another domain is the state of apparent arousal for the kid. So are they alert? Are they looking around? Or are they whimpering, turning away? What's their state of apparent arousal? The use of parents, another domain. Are they hanging out with their parents, or are they using their parents as like their security blanket? So, sorry, let me stick here for a sec. So we took all of those domains and we would add up people's scores on each domain. And then the resultant number would be their score on the YPAS. So if we have good inter-rater reliability, then all kinds of observers are going to come up with the same number, the same score, or really close to the same score for every child. That would mean that they had acceptable inter-rater reliability on our operationalized construct of pre-operational anxiety. I hope that made sense. We operationalized the construct of pre-operative anxiety. Too many operations. Oh my goodness. So we had an article that was published. This was actually before I got there to be there on faculty. So our criterion was, how did the YPAS compare to another test that we know measures anxiety? And so you're comparing the YPAS to a known true measure of anxiety. And that gave you criterion-related validity for the scale. We also looked at, in a different article, how useful is that YPAS. And so this is actually a different group. One of the people in one of the authors was in our original group, but this is a much more recent article, The Utility of the YPAS. So how useful is this scale? You know, who cares if a kid's anxious or not? What does that even mean? So here you're looking at the meaning. How can I use the YPAS to help me? And so in here, it helped save money because it would predict the kids that needed extra help when they had an MRI, as opposed to the kids who are going to be just fine without extra help. So that there was usefulness is utility. So you want a measurement to have some utility and to demonstrate making a difference in real life. So to review for today, what we talked about was independent variables. Those are the ones the researchers manipulate or change. Dependent variables, those are the ones you measure to see what the outcome was. Control variables, those are the ones that you hold constant, that you keep the same. You operationalize. When you operationalize something that you're measuring, like a construct, what you're doing is you're deciding how you're going to measure it. You're being precise about your definition so that you can measure it in a reliable and valid way. So as we look at reliability and validity of the measure, you want to make sure it has good construct validity. It measures what it says it measures. It has good criterion validity. In other words, it correlates with other measures of the same thing. Content validity, it looks at the whole picture. It doesn't just take a small slice. And then face validity, it actually seems like it measures the thing it says it measures. We looked at that example of criterion-related validity with the YPAS and utility, whether something is useful. So that is what we talked about today. That is a lot of chapter 4 in terms of understanding how do you use the scientific method. Tomorrow we will talk about introductions. Tomorrow will be a fairly short lecture so that you can get started on writing your introduction. And we'll see you then. All right.